I've never told this story to anyone who actually knows me. Online feels different. Maybe because nobody here has to look me in the eye afterward. This happened years ago, back when I convinced myself that crossing certain lines didn't make me a bad person, it just made me someone who knew how to survive. Looking back, I can see how many excuses I stacked on top of each other until they looked like reasons. The whole thing started with a forgotten brass key. It looked ordinary. Scratched, tarnished, small enough to disappear into a pocket. I found it tucked inside an old wooden box I bought at an estate sale, hidden beneath faded letters and yellowed photographs. I almost threw it away, but there was a tiny paper tag tied to it with brittle string. On it, someone had written in shaky handwriting, "Basement. Don't lose this again." Most people would have laughed and moved on. I didn't. The address on the letters belonged to a mansion that had been abandoned for decades. Everyone in town knew the place. Kids dared each other to sneak inside. Urban explorers posted blurry photos online. The owners had vanished into legal disputes years earlier, leaving the building to decay behind rusted gates. I became obsessed. Not because I believed there was buried treasure. Because I wanted to know what that key opened. Curiosity has always been my worst habit. It doesn't stay curiosity for long. It turns into fixation. Then planning. Then action. That's how nearly every crime I've ever committed began, not with anger or greed, but with the belief that I deserved to know something no one else did. And that little forgotten key was about to open a door nobody even realized existed. For about a week, I couldn't stop thinking about that key. I even told myself I was only satisfying my curiosity, but deep down I knew I was already drifting into dangerous territory. The address from the old letters matched an abandoned mansion on the edge of town, a place surrounded by rumors and rusting fences. People claimed it had been searched dozens of times, yet nobody ever mentioned a basement. I started doing my homework. Old newspaper archives, property records, forgotten forum posts, anything that mentioned the estate. Most of it was useless, but I learned one important thing: the house had once belonged to a wealthy collector who supposedly distrusted banks. That single detail planted an idea I couldn't shake. Instead of asking permission to explore the property, I convinced myself nobody cared anymore. It wasn't my house, and I knew entering it would be trespassing. Even so, I packed a flashlight, gloves, a crowbar, fresh batteries, and the little brass key. Looking back, that's the moment curiosity became a crime in progress. I went just before sunrise on a Saturday, figuring there'd be fewer people around. The neighborhood was quiet, and the mansion looked even worse up close than it did in photos. Windows were boarded up, vines covered the brick walls, and the front gate hung crooked on one hinge. I slipped through a gap in the fence and kept telling myself I was just exploring. That lie made it easier to ignore the fact that I was trespassing. Inside, the air smelled like damp wood and mold. Every step echoed through the empty rooms, making me freeze more than once. I expected to find graffiti, broken furniture, maybe evidence that other explorers had been there. Instead, the place felt strangely untouched. I searched for nearly an hour without finding anything that looked like a basement entrance. Then, in what used to be the library, I noticed something odd. One of the massive bookcases didn't sit flush against the wall. There was a narrow gap behind it, almost invisible unless you looked from the side. That's when the forgotten key started making terrifying sense. I wedged the crowbar into the side of the bookcase and pushed as carefully as I could. It barely moved at first, groaning loud enough to make me think the whole neighborhood had heard it. I stopped, listened, and waited. Nothing. Just silence and the occasional creak from the old house settling. After another minute of struggling, the bookcase shifted enough to reveal a narrow wooden door built into the wall. It was so well hidden that I doubt anyone would have noticed it without moving the shelves. My heart started pounding. The paper tag tied to the brass key suddenly felt less like a coincidence and more like a set of instructions left behind decades earlier. I slid the key into the lock, expecting it to fail after all those years. Instead, it turned with surprising ease. The click echoed through the room. Behind the door was a steep staircase disappearing into darkness. For a long moment, I just stood there. Part of me wanted to leave immediately. The other part, the one that always got me into trouble, was already taking the first step down. The staircase seemed longer than it should have been. Every step stirred up dust that sparkled in the beam of my flashlight, and the air grew colder the farther I descended. When I finally reached the bottom, I found myself in a surprisingly large underground room. It wasn't a dungeon or some forgotten tunnel like I'd imagined. It looked more like a private vault. Metal shelves lined the walls, most of them empty except for rotting boxes and jars filled with things I couldn't identify. In the center sat an old steel safe, covered with a thick layer of dust. Judging by the undisturbed floor around it, nobody had touched it in years. I should have walked away right then. Finding the hidden room was already enough to satisfy anyone's curiosity. Instead, I started examining the safe, wondering if the collector had really hidden valuables down there. The thought that something valuable might still be inside drowned out every sensible warning in my head. That's when trespassing began to slide towards something much worse. The safe wasn't locked with a modern keypad or anything complicated. It had an old mechanical dial and a reinforced handle that had seen better days. I tried the brass key anyway, even though I knew it probably belonged only to the hidden door. It didn't fit. For a second, I actually laughed at myself. Then I noticed faint scratches around the hinges, as if someone had once tried to force it open but given up. That should have been another sign to leave. Instead, I pulled the crowbar from my backpack. I told myself I wasn't stealing because I didn't even know if there was anything inside. I was just looking. It's amazing how creative your brain becomes when it's trying to excuse something you already know is wrong. After several exhausting minutes of prying and twisting, the rusted metal finally gave way with a sharp crack. The door lurched open a few inches. I remember staring into that narrow gap, realizing there was no pretending anymore. Whatever happened next, I had deliberately broken into a safe that wasn't mine. The crime was no longer accidental, it was a choice. I expected stacks of cash or velvet bags full of jewelry. That's what every story about hidden safes leads you to believe. Instead, I found several leather-bound ledgers, a few sealed envelopes, and a small wooden case wrapped in faded cloth. For a moment, I actually felt disappointed. I'd risked breaking into an abandoned property for what looked like old paperwork. Then I opened the wooden case. Inside were dozens of old gold coins, neatly arranged in rows, along with a handful of antique watches. Even under the weak beam of my flashlight, they gleamed. My pulse jumped instantly. I knew enough about collectibles to realize they could be worth a fortune. I just stood there, staring. Nobody else knew this room existed. Nobody was coming to stop me. That thought was the most dangerous part. I slipped a few coins into my pocket, telling myself I'd only take a small amount. If anyone ever discovered the vault, they would never notice a handful missing. At least, that's what I convinced myself. Looking back, that was the exact moment I became a thief, not just an intruder. I had just zipped my backpack when I heard something above me. A dull thud. Then another. At first I thought the old house was settling again, but the sounds came in a rhythm, slow footsteps crossing the floor directly over the hidden room. Every muscle in my body locked up. I switched off my flashlight, and the basement disappeared into absolute darkness. The footsteps stopped. For several seconds, there was nothing but silence. Then I heard the scrape of the bookcase moving. Someone else had found the entrance. My heart hammered so hard I was sure it echoed through the room. I crouched behind a shelf, clutching my backpack, trying to slow my breathing. A beam of light cut through the darkness as another flashlight swept down the stairs. It wasn't the police. It looked like another urban explorer, probably someone who had noticed the shifted bookcase after I'd forced it open. He called out, asking if anyone was there. I didn't answer. Instead, I waited in complete silence, hoping he'd convince himself the place was empty and turn around before he discovered what I'd done. The flashlight beam drifted across the room, lingering on the broken safe. I could hear the other guy breathing as he stepped cautiously into the vault. He wasn't shouting or acting aggressive, just confused. Then he muttered, almost to himself, "Someone's been here." I realized hiding forever wasn't an option. If he came another few steps, he'd see me. So I did the first thing that came to mind. I stood up with my hands visible and acted as startled as he was. I told him I'd stumbled across the hidden room only minutes earlier and had found the safe already damaged. The words came out so naturally that, for a moment, I almost believed them myself. He looked at the bent door, then at my backpack, then back at me. I could tell he wasn't convinced, but he also didn't have proof. After an awkward conversation, we agreed to leave separately and never mention the place. Walking back to my car, I kept replaying that lie. Stealing the coins had felt wrong, but lying straight to someone's face somehow made the whole thing feel even heavier. For 2 days, I couldn't bring myself to even look at the coins. I left them hidden in the back of my closet, wrapped in the same faded cloth from the wooden case. Every time I walked past them, I felt a strange mix of excitement and dread. They represented everything I'd crossed the line for and everything I could still lose. Eventually, greed won. I drove to a neighboring town instead of staying local. I figured a small antique shop there wouldn't ask too many questions. I rehearsed a story on the way, claiming the coins had belonged to my grandfather and I'd recently inherited them. The owner examined one under a magnifying glass without saying much. Then he looked at me for a long moment that felt far too long. Instead of making an offer, he casually asked if I had any paperwork proving where they'd come from. I said no. He nodded, handed the coin back, and told me I might have better luck at a specialized auction house. I left smiling politely, but inside I was panicking. For the first time, it hit me that stolen valuables aren't nearly as easy to sell as movies make them look. After that visit, paranoia settled into my routine. Every unfamiliar car parked on my street made me glance through the curtains. If someone knocked on my door unexpectedly, my stomach tightened before I even checked who it was. I hadn't been confronted by the police or contacted by anyone connected to the mansion, but the fear came anyway. It didn't need evidence to grow. I searched local news every morning, half expecting to see a headline about the hidden vault being discovered. Days passed with nothing. Then weeks. The silence should have reassured me, yet it had the opposite effect. My imagination filled the gaps. I pictured security footage I didn't know existed, fingerprints I might have left behind, or the other explorer deciding to report what he'd seen. The coins stayed hidden. I couldn't spend them, sell them, or even enjoy owning them. They had become useless pieces of metal wrapped in guilt. That was the irony I never anticipated. I had taken something valuable, but instead of feeling richer, I felt like I traded away the simple comfort of not having anything to hide. About a month later, I drove back to the mansion before dawn. The backpack sat on the passenger seat beside me, heavier than it had any right to feel. Inside were the gold coins, the antique watches, and a handwritten note that I knew would never explain enough. I kept asking myself why I was going back. It wasn't courage. It wasn't redemption. I think I was just exhausted. Living with the constant fear of being discovered had become its own punishment. The house looked exactly as I remembered it, only quieter. I slipped inside, found the hidden door, and descended the stairs one last time. The broken safe was still there, untouched. I placed everything back as carefully as I could. The note simply said that whoever found the room deserved the truth more than I deserved what I'd taken. I knew returning the items didn't erase the theft or the damage I'd caused. The safe was still broken, and I'd still trespassed. But climbing those stairs, I felt something I hadn't experienced since finding the forgotten key. Relief. Not complete relief, but enough to breathe again. Returning everything didn't magically erase what I'd done. I stopped checking the news every hour, but the memories stayed with me. Every time someone brought up abandoned buildings or old family heirlooms, I'd feel a knot in my stomach. They were ordinary conversations for everyone else. For me, they were reminders of a decision I couldn't undo. Months later, I learned that the mansion had finally been purchased. Renovation crews were clearing out the property when they reportedly uncovered a hidden basement behind the library. The story spread around town for a few days. People speculated about what had been found down there, but nobody seemed to know the details. I read every article I could find, expecting to see mention of a broken safe or missing items. There wasn't a word. Maybe the owners kept it quiet. Maybe my note was found and discarded. Maybe nobody wanted unnecessary attention. I never learned the truth. Oddly enough, that uncertainty became part of my punishment. I wasn't arrested, questioned, or publicly exposed. Instead, I was left alone with the knowledge that I'd betrayed my own principles for a chance at something that was never truly mine. People often assume that getting away with a crime feels like winning. I used to think that too. The reality was far less dramatic. There was no celebration, no sense of accomplishment, no moment where I felt smarter than everyone else. What stayed with me wasn't the thrill of opening that hidden door, it was the realization of how easily I had justified every step along the way. Looking back, the biggest danger wasn't the abandoned mansion or the possibility of getting caught. It was the quiet voice in my head that kept saying, just this once. First it excused trespassing. Then breaking open a safe. Then theft. Then lying to a complete stranger. None of those choices felt enormous in the moment because I'd already convinced myself the previous one wasn't a big deal. That's how people slide into doing things they once swore they'd never do. I still think about that forgotten key sometimes. Not because of what it unlocked beneath the house, but because of what it unlocked inside me. That discovery turned out to be far more unsettling than anything hidden behind the wall. If you've made it this far, you're probably expecting me to end with some dramatic twist, that I was secretly arrested years later or that the hidden vault contained something far more sinister than old coins. It didn't. The truth is quieter than that, and maybe that's why it has stayed with me for so long. The forgotten key opened a concealed door, but it also exposed parts of my character that I didn't want to believe were there. I learned that most bad decisions don't arrive looking like crimes. They begin as harmless curiosity, a convenient excuse, or the belief that nobody will ever know. By the time you recognize what you've become, you've already crossed several lines you once considered impossible. I was lucky. I escaped the legal consequences that could have followed my actions. Plenty of people aren't that fortunate, and many leave behind victims whose losses can't simply be returned to a safe. So if you ever find yourself standing in front of a door that feels too tempting to open, ask yourself one question before you turn the key: are you prepared to live with the person you'll become after it opens? That answer will matter long after the mystery is gone.